Hi. It's a hot day in August. I have a dog sitting on me. So I thought I'd talk about the greatest Christmas movie ever made, which is, of course, say it with me, everybody. Maggie, Tiku, Spike, Bo is around here somewhere. Die Hard, of course. Die Hard, my, hold on. My main purpose is to discuss, there you go, some basic concepts and misconceptions about storytelling. And I think Die Hard functions as essentially the perfect story on so many levels. But one of the things that it demonstrates in a really fascinating way is the difference between good bad movies and just good movies. Because there are a lot of movies that are similar to that, came before it and after it. A lot of action movies of the 80s that are good bad movies. Hi. But what? I'm not talking to you right now. I'm not talking to you right now. Thank you. And I think that's one of the really fascinating underexplored areas of storytelling. The idea of what a good bad movie is. Even in that phrasing. That's such an inarticulate phrasing. But it's a definite thing that exists. Yet, in our attempt to really understand what a good story is, that's something that we just neglect. We just talk about what is a good story and what is a bad story. This very dualistic false universals, which I talked about before. This is good and this is bad. And that's how a lot of the instruction and storytelling really falls down into that really simplistic duality. A good story has this. A bad story has this, which is ineffective, inaccurate, underdeveloped in every way possible. And there are a lot of those areas where there are things that we just take for granted and we don't really talk about or deal with or talk about it in a really articulate way. We talk about, I talk about good bad movies all the time. Some of my favorite movies are so-called good bad movies, but it's such an inarticulate phrase for that. It's such a bad thing to call them. So we need new language for them. You can sit down. Okay, there you go. Sit down. Good girl. Good girl. Okay. Maggie is a good girl. Okay. You'll be my elbow rest. There you go. You sit still. Where was I? So it actually links up to what I was talking about last time, because one of the areas where I think is underdeveloped is the idea of metaphor and parataxis. A lot of people just use the phrase metaphor as this overarching concept. Whereas parataxis, there's so many different varieties of parataxis that don't necessarily have to mean anything or stand in for anything or represent anything. And so I just think that's taken for granted and underexplored. My creative writing education experience, the metaphor, this is an actual metaphor, the metaphor I always use for it is that it's like I was hoping to go to medical school and all they taught was how to use leeches. They didn't really explain why leeches work or give any sort of alternative. They just said, leeches work sometimes, therefore the only thing you need to know about medicine is the leeches, and that's it. And that's a metaphor because it stands in for an abstraction and helps you understand it better. It's a very cerebral sort of function for that imagery. But that's beside the point. Another area that's really thoroughly underexplored is what really defines greatness, especially when your perception... Hold on. Sit down. There we go. Good girl. Especially when your perception of greatness is that something doesn't have the outward appearance of something that could possibly be great. So I could say something like, Die Hard is the greatest movie of all time. And you could say, it's in this genre called action movies. So how could it be the greatest movie of all time? especially in direct comparison to other movies in the genre. John McTiernan, who directed that, actually arguably directed two of the greatest action movies of all time. Predator the year before, and then Die Hard. And it's actually very interesting to compare those two directly. And then he directed the greatest action movie satire, really underappreciated movie that bombed at the time, The Last Action Hero. But I think it's growing in appreciation, just because people see just how ingenious it is on many levels. But I think the way to really understand something like Predator, which is arguably half good bad movie and half actually good movie. Die Hard, which arguably is a good movie that happens to be in this genre that has lots of bad movies and good bad movies in it. And The Last Action Hero, which is a satire, which actually accomplishes being arguably, a lot of people will disagree, of course, but arguably accomplishes being a good movie, despite also being a satire at the same time. And there's a lot. There are a lot of examples of legitimate good bad movies that came out around that same time. Rocky III came out, I think, 88, something like that. That is arguably a good bad movie. Maniac Cop came out that year. There's a lot of action movies like that. But around that time, definitely. Steven Seagal movies really started that year. I think Above the Law was that year. Steven Seagal movies are a perfect example of this. But what really I would argue, this is deeply underexplored and it needs a lot more exploration, and contains a lot of tools that storytellers could use to enhance their consciousness of how to increase enjoyment of their stories, but also consciousness of why people enjoy the stories. So instead of teaching the leeches, teaching actual medicine, understanding. There goes the dog. Okay. There you go. You okay? All right. Understanding how they actually work instead of just having this, really remedial understanding of how stories work, and then relying on things that merely work and not really exploring why they work. But I think the way to really understand the difference between good movies and good bad movies is really on the third level of the rainbow circle. My friend, the rainbow circle. Really at the center of the rainbow circle, the dogs are watching me. The center of the rainbow circle is the visceral experience. So it could be, action movies have these really basic visceral experiences, explosions, action, fighting, killing, blood, guts, whatever. And those, if it's just that, it can burn itself out. I talked about that before with What Dreams May Come. Just superficially, that should be an emotionally stimulating story, but it just burns out. Because it's so overwhelming, it triggers your resistance to the stimulation. It's a pull between the two ends. Let's just do it this way. It's a pull between the two ends of the spectrum. This end of the spectrum is pulling against the stimulation. This end of the spectrum is pulling towards the stimulation. So if you get an overabundance of explosions and things like that, if you think of like a Michael Bay movie, for example, there are a lot of Michael Bay movies you could call good bad movies, but there are a lot of them you can just call bad movies. It's a totally subjective thing, of course, but if you watch one of the Transformers movies, you become numb to it because it's just this unrelenting pace of action. You become numb to it, and so it no longer has this visceral effect. It's not strategically getting around the natural resistance to making yourself numb to the action, because of the basic structure of the story, the unrelenting pace of the stimulating factor. the inhuman stimulating factor. Another basic stimulating factor is the empathetic experience with the character. So if the character's in danger, if the character's angry, you feel the anger. If the character's scared, you feel the fear. All of that churning together. The next level, I would say, the moving out from the center, the paradoxical level, is a good level for understanding how the characters work, how to really anchor your story in a character that's going to keep the audience from being numb to the constant barrage of explosions and what have you. And I would say with Die Hard, spoiler alert, that's the key, is the paradoxical level. But another key to really understanding it is the schematic level. That's the third level. And the schematic level, the third level, is an organizational system that's intrinsic to the story itself. So, and that's kind of the key when you're talking about a satire. If you're... so many animals on my lap. In my way. Okay, this is Bo. Where was I? So the schema of the action story, one of the ways to think of a schema is genre expectations. That's a really useful, common way to use them. So if you have the genre expectations of an action movie, with a real typical action movie, around that time you had, the ultra typical action movies like Cobra or Commando, after Rambo 1 was much more nuanced, First Blood, I should say, was a much more nuanced character piece, but Rambo 2 and 3 were, lacked that nuance. But Rambo 2 and 3, Commando and Cobra are always ones I go to. A lot of the action movies of the time, a lot of them mixed together, sci-fi or something else. Like Predator is essentially a sci-fi movie, or Terminator is essentially a sci-fi movie. But the pure action movies, Lethal Weapon is a buddy cop action movie. That's another one. Like the first one, arguably the first two are in the territory of Die Hard, where they're almost good movies. Where was I? Schema. So yeah, the schema is the genre expectations of an action movie. You have plenty of genre expectations. Fulfilling those genre expectations can create stimulation, but to fulfill them to such a degree that they become predictable can reduce stimulation. I don't know what my cat is doing. She was stuck on the wall for a second. But fulfilling them in such an orderly format that they become predictable can reduce stimulation. To defy schema can cause the reader to reject the piece. So, action movies, the action star always beats the bad guy. That's if you do it in such a way that all the different elements are unpredictable, you can enhance the stimulation. If the good guy loses and the bad guy wins, that's surprising. That shifts your schematic expectations from the hero winning, but it might be done to such a degree that, like the overabundance of explosions, the viewer rejects, that schematic break, for example. And so you have something like The Last Action Hero that foregrounds all those schematic expectations and plays around with them in order to poke fun at them, look at the flaws in them, but also to create a whole new story, essentially. I think that's the element. A lot of the reason that failed at the time was because people were genuinely sick of it. Most of the action movies in the mid-90s were either satires, like True Lies is another one that James Cameron, of course, does great action movies. True Lies is one that plays with those expectations and subverts them in many ways to an effective outcome. But for the most part, movies like Judge Dredd, that movies like Demolition Man is a kind of a weird in-between one too, but they're good bad movies, because they had, if you look at John Barth's Literature of Exhaustion, that particular schema had been exhausted to such a degree that it could no longer stimulate. So you could, I mean, something like the overabundant, the Michael Bay type overabundance of explosions numbing the audience. You can look at that within the story, but you can look at that across, a genre, of course. So, what makes a good bad movie is essentially the same thing that makes a comedy work. There were a lot of police comedies at the time, where the comedy was centered on the idea of the police doing, something foolish. That same year I think it was the same year Die Hard came out, the second highest grossing movie that year was Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and that's kind of the juxtaposition of two conflicting schema of the police drama and the cartoon. That was really the center of the comedy. But action movies, I think, are good prime fodder for comedy. Last Action Hero, for example, or True Lies had a lot of funny stuff in it, subjectively. But what makes it a good fodder for comedy is the pretense, and that's something that makes good bad movies arguably so enjoyable. Is the pretense of seriousness. So I think 88 was the same year Naked Gun came out. Naked Gun is a perfect example of that. The source of the comedy in Naked Gun is just the level of complete seriousness that Leslie Nielsen treats the material with. He, the character, clearly thinks that he's a really great cop, and treats just the total absurdity around him with complete seriousness. And it wouldn't have been nearly as funny if he was just wacky. You can compare that with Ace Ventura. There's another police comedy. Ace Ventura himself is the wacky, crazy absurdity, but everybody around him plays it very seriously. But what makes a good bad action movie, if you look at like a Steven Seagal movie, the complete seriousness with which he treats the material. And we can recognize that, it's undeserving, arguably, undeserving of the seriousness that he's so pretentious. A Steven Seagal character is probably the most serious of all of the action movie characters. The most straight-faced of all the action movie characters. So we can recognize the disconnection. And you could call it, that's the bad part of the good bad. You can call it bad, but you could also recognize it as being absurd in kind of a similar way that the Naked Gun movies are. So it's a disconnected schema. It's Bob Hoskins is in a world where cartoons exist. Bob Hoskins is the serious Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Bob Hoskins is the serious police officer, but he's in a world where cartoons exist, and he's playing out a lot of the cliches. He wants to get revenge for the death of his partner, killed by a cartoon. That disconnection is the source of the comedy, and the pretense is the source of the comedy. Bob Hoskins or Leslie Nielsen or Steven Seagal, they're all functioning in this very serious story, but all around them is totally absurd and wacky and crazy. And so that disconnect is the source of the comedy. So a lot of good bad movies, quote unquote good bad movies, I would say the joy in them is not in the competency of the director. John McTiernan is a great director, but a lot of these other directors, are not great directors. It's not in the competency of the acting. I don't know if anyone would say Steven Seagal is a great actor. It's that, that's not where the joy comes from. The joy comes from the disconnect. The good of the good bad comes from the disconnect between the total seriousness of a character who thinks he's in a very serious action movie versus the total absurdity of the world surrounding him. So if you look at something like Predator, the the good bad part of it, quote unquote good bad part of it, comes in the beginning, and that it's so extremely over the top in the beginning with its action movie cliches, and that's part of the joy of watching Arnold Schwarzenegger movies. Is he's very charming, not necessarily a great actor based on whatever standards you're using. But he's very charming and interesting and entertaining in many ways. But he also takes it pretty seriously for the most part. He seems to be a character who thinks he's in a different movie than he actually is in. So a lot of his movies are enjoyable because of that disconnect as well. And so, the beating of Predator is so over the top with Arnold Schwarzenegger, Carl Weathers, Jesse Ventura, bless Jesse Ventura and his wacky craziness. It's so over the top and extreme. I mean, you could take any part of that and say, this is the most extreme, broiness of an action movie in the 80s. But I think when it gets really good and enjoyable, when it switches from a good bad movie to a genuinely good movie, is when they are really helpless against the Predator. The Predator. A lot of the monster movies at the time, the joy in it is in just the the delight of the monster, himself or itself or herself. There are plenty of these horror movies and monster movies where it's just a purely joyful monster. The Predator has a great design, but I think what makes Predator, the first Predator, so rewatchable is that they're so thoroughly vulnerable. So the pretense of being these macho murderous, basically, they go through murdering people. These super macho murderous characters being humbled to such an extreme degree by this alien monster. Best part of the movie, arguably, is when Arnold Schwarzenegger's character Dutch, his name is Dutch. Dutch is in the Deus Ex Machina mod, which is one of the sloppiest Deus Ex Machinas ever in film, but I love it. It is a flaw in the film, but it's an enjoyable flaw. He gets in this mud, and the Predator can't see him because of this magic mud. In that scene, he's so broken down by the Predator and so vulnerable that he becomes a much more compelling character if he's than he is in the beginning of the movie, where he's just where he's just invulnerable essentially, and so tough, and nobody can touch him. But then the Predator comes through and just wrecks all of that. And then a year later, you have the perfect action character in John McClane, of course. And the key to John McClane, I would say the reason why the first movie works better than any of the other movies, with the exception of number 3, and I love all the Die Hard, confession, I love all the Die Hard movies. I don't think they're great movies, but I do love John McClane as a character. But I think why the first one works much, much better exponentially. It's one of the greatest movies of all time versus, just an okay movie for the rest of them. Arguably, with the exception of number 3. Is that he's barefoot. So you first meet John McClane. This is the key, I would say, that makes the character much, much more compelling and makes it infinitely rewatchable. I've seen it a couple of thousand times. And makes it, a movie where most of the action movies you couldn't necessarily, arguably, they haven't aged well. You couldn't necessarily watch them now and get the same kind of enjoyment now from them. It's hard to take a lot of them seriously, but you can rewatch Die Hard, take it very seriously, and it ranks as one of the, it ranks up with any great movie today. And I think it's really at the core of it is John McClane as a character. The fact that he's barefoot. When you first meet him, he's really pathetic. The reason he's barefoot is because he's making fists in the carpet to relieve his stress. He's on the verge of divorce. He's carrying a giant teddy bear. Everything about him is really pathetic at first. And there's never a moment where, arguably, never a moment where he seems invulnerable. There's never a moment where, it's quite different from the Predator, where he starts invulnerable and becomes more vulnerable. He's always this pathetic, desperate character who's on the verge of dying, and he's bleeding, and he's the greatest scene is when he's limping towards Hans, who has Holly, at gunpoint next to the window, covered in blood, and he's a trickster character, and that's a whole other schema too, and I could get into that later, but his ultimate point of vulnerability, he's had glass in his feet, he's been blown up, he's been shot, he's been, totally taken from kind of a pathetic guy who's fighting desperately and may die any second, to this guy who's totally beaten up in every way possible, and just limping and calling to Holly, who's his estranged wife. So you don't have the pretense in the same way, to the degree that where it becomes unintentionally comedic. Or something like Last Action Hero is intentionally comedic, but it becomes unintentionally comedic. If you look at Steven Seagal, you laugh at him, but it's probably not what he wanted, arguably. Because there's very, very little pretense to the character. He's not putting up a facade of being a tough guy. He's desperate. He's vulnerable. He's afraid. He feels pain. He feels anger. He feels a whole complex of emotions. He feels shame. He's still able to he's still able to feel this whole complex of other emotions, and specifically dealing with his estranged wife. And so that gives it. One thing I talked about before is duration of stimulation, and that's the sense that duration of stimulation can mean a lot of things, but where you can watch a movie that has a lot of explosions, and it's structured in such a way that you're never numb to it. You're never numb to those more base level stimulating factors like explosions, and violence and blood and what have you. That you're never numb to that. It's structured in such a way that that's constantly increasing. And you're never numb to John McClane's feelings, because he has these complex array of feelings that he's constantly up and down. He's a roller coaster of these different conflicting, paradoxical emotions. There's level 2 right there. He's this array of all of these different paradoxical emotions throughout the story. So you're never numb to the empathetic experience with him. But also duration of stimulation in the sense that it's structured in such an effective way that it ages really well. So you can look back at a movie from 1988, and you can still feel essentially the same way about, and you can keep watching it over and over again. There's really no objective way to really say something is good or good bad. That in and of itself, that phrasing in and of itself is false, in the sense that it's purely subjective. It's just personally, I think that Die Hard is good, and I think that Maniac Cop or Above the Law is good bad. It's just on a purely personal level. That terminology only works out on the subjective level. But one of the few factors that comes closest to an objective measure of, let's say Die Hard being a great movie, is the duration of stimulation, in the sense that it still impacts people. You still talk to people today, and they'll say, Die Hard's my favorite Christmas movie, or Die Hard's my favorite movie, action movie. Obviously the best action movie of the period, or of all time, arguably. And one of the things that I become fixated on and fascinated by is comparing, the top movies and top box office movies to the award winners. That year, 1988, the number one box office movie was Rain Man, and that also won Best Picture. That's kind of a weird anomaly. Um, doesn't happen very frequently, but it also makes me curious why people don't talk about Rain Man nearly as much as they talk about Die Hard. Just from my perception, I guess. People don't look back at 1988 and say the greatest movie of 1988 was Rain Man, obviously, even though it has that sort of rare example of, rarely ever happens. If you look at a whole pattern of year after year, the Best Picture winner frequently is right in the middle of the list of the top 10 highest grossing movies of the year. That is really common, but it's very, very rare for it to be number one. Titanic being another example. And Titanic is a perfect example of a movie where it has not aged well, arguably. People's perception of it, memory of it, the duration of stimulation is very limited. And there's all kinds of reasons for that. And, it's kind of off topic, but that's an interesting sort of anomaly where you have a movie like Rain Man, for whatever reason, it was so beloved at the time. It was this huge sensation, won all the Oscars. But today, for whatever reason, it's not quite as loved. Whereas Die Hard was only like number 7 in the highest grossing. It's that sort of movie you would think would be, the highest grossing. The highest grossing was Rain Man, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and whatever else. Interesting list, by all means. But anyway, I could talk on and on about Die Hard. Make sure to smash that like button and share and subscribe. And also, hi grandkids. I'm really only doing this because in case I die any day now, to get my ideas down. The fact that I love Die Hard so much, I guess, is important. I don't know, maybe not. But I'll just cut it off. Have a good night.